Thank you for clicking onto this reaction. I hope you're looking forward to it just as much as I am. If you haven't already, head over to the content creators page. That link is in the description box down below. If you haven't already and you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we're going to jump straight into this one. Count Dankula's absolute mad lads. Lauri Allan Torni. Let's go.
It's no secret that we are all big fans of freedom on this channel. I believe that regardless of your values or background, you should have the right to live your life in whatever way you see fit, as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. But unfortunately, not everyone agrees, and every time we as a society manage to get a good thing going, the spectre of authoritarianism rears its ugly head to insist that you don't have the right to be just left alone, while also fleecing you for all that you're worth. In the 20th century, that spectre took on the guise of communism with the rise of the Soviet Union. And the boot came down so hard that it killed over 20 million people in Stalin's regime. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that many people have a searing hatred for communists, especially after they started to invade other countries. And one man hated communists so much that he gave everything he had to fight back. Even after the war for his homeland had ended, he stopped at nothing to make the Soviets pay. And he didn't particularly care who he had to work with in order to do it. Major Lauri Torni, the soldier of 3 armies.
Okay.
I want to know what armies he's involved in.
I've
got an idea for one of them.
I know, I'm now thinking the Germans.
Yeah, he definitely fought with the Germans.
Did he?
He's got to.
He's got to have, because that's where my mind's going. But where else?
I'm going to say SS part of Germans.
Nah, it can't be that bad.
I don't know.
Finns,
Please leave
maybe?
a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the video,
Oh
it is
no,
in
I was
fact
okay with your
boy,
intro, but you...
Raid Shadow Legends.
Raid
Lauri Allan Torni was born on the 28th of May 1919 in the town of Viborg within the province of Viipuri in Finland, where he had a pretty normal childhood. In school, he did very well in sports, especially skiing and boxing.
Okay.
Because Finnish. However, it quickly became apparent that Torni was very stubborn while growing up, and he ended up having to repeat a year of school because he refused to sing, which was part of his classes for some reason.
What?
And judging by the lifelong...
Cause...
A singer?
No, it was a part of the school curriculum.
Fuck that.
And basically, he said, no, I'm not singing, and he's Finnish, and he's stubborn. And they said, well, in that case, you get expelled. And he's like, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm getting expelled.
Yeah, cuz.
I ain't singing for
like,
shit.
well, I ain't doing a
Assemblies,
stupid thing.
just like... Just like fucking mouth, like...
seething grudge that we will get into soon. I think it's safe to say that stubbornness would continue to be one of his defining traits well into adulthood. In September of 1938, while in business school, an 18-year-old Torni volunteered for military service by joining the Army Reserves, just in time for duty to call. You see, the Soviet Union wanted some strategically important Finnish islands and a military base, while Finland wanted their territory to not be stolen. So, naturally, there was a bit of a conflict of interest there, and when the two countries reached an impasse, the Soviets decided to invade on the 30th of November 1939, starting the Winter War. Now, you would think that such an overwhelming force marching into such a small country means that the war would be over in about 5 seconds, but no, it was actually close. To put it extremely mildly, as we discussed in our White Death video, the Soviet leadership were absolutely fucking atrocious. They had no idea what the fuck they were doing, because
I didn't realise he covered the White Death as well. That's the Finnish shoulder that we
Yeah.
watched, the Sabaton one. I didn't realise he'd done a video as well. So we need to watch that as well.
I've seen it, it's good.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Allen had purged all the competent generals. So the Red Army wasn't really equipped for the invasion, metaphorically and literally. The men were terribly trained and they were sent in wearing green uniforms. They went to fight a war in Finland in the winter wearing green uniforms. Compare that to what the Finns were wearing. Can you see why Simo Hawa didn't need a scope? But while these absolute shambles, the Finns were mobilised
that was good.
immediately, with many men going straight to the front lines with their own clothes and personal weapons. Torni himself went out to meet the Soviet invaders as part of the 4th Jaeger Infantry Battalion, where he quickly impressed his superiors on the battlefield by stealthing his way deep behind enemy lines on skis to restore communications between his unit and headquarters. As luck would have it, well,
That's
for Torni
sick.
at least, there was a shortage of officers at the time, probably because the Soviets were killing them all. So Torni was sent to Reserve Officer School. His grades weren't great, but he more than made up for it by being heavily awarded for combat, which earned him the rank of 2nd Lieutenant.
Nice.
Now a commissioned officer, Lieutenant Torni found himself in charge of his own company of hardy Scandinavians that were moulded by the frigid Norse climate, like angry, grizzled snowmen, and more than able and willing to eviscerate a bunch of untrained Soviet conscripts. The only problem was they all spoke Swedish. So not only did Torni have to cross Soviet lines, but also a language barrier.
Oh,
However, he took this in
no.
his stride and he led his men by example.
Okay.
Like
nice.
saying, when I start shooting, join in. He also seemed to understand the assignment whenever Torni said, let's blow up the invaders, which his unit had learned because that was pretty much the only thing he said to them. This leadership style, aided by hand gestures, led to devastating results for the Soviets as Torni and his men wiped out entire rifle divisions and even a tank battalion. While Torni himself was
A tank battalion? A tank battalion?
I'll give him that.
A tank
He
battalion?
blow stuff up.
What?
I respect it. He likes to blow stuff up.
When he goes by that one sentence and hand gestures, I'm imagining that's you as a commander. Blow it up. Left, right, stop, go. And that's all you would do.
I'd have specific hand signals. Like it would be.
an absolute weapon in his own right. He
already know
came
one of
from
them.
very good stock, while the Soviets almost went out of their way to make themselves easy pickings. The Finnish resistance to the invasion hinged on the strategic brilliance of its men. Snipers absolutely devastated the Soviet forces, while the rank and file employed guerrilla tactics to ravage their enemies deep behind Soviet lines, cutting off entire sections of the Red Army and wiping them out while they were vulnerable. They also used
strong.
mannequins to inflate their perceived numbers, chucked Molotov cocktails into tanks to blow them up, and, for good measure, they put Soviet corpses on display as a scare tactic. So I think that the scariest thing that the Finns did was trolling the Soviet airwaves.
Oh,
Yeah,
go on.
the Finns trolled the Russians by blasting Saki Yarvin Polka across all of the Russian radio channels 24 hours a day. Imagine suddenly waking up in the middle of the night to a Finnish ambush, the cracks of rifles being your alarm clock. You're desperately scrambling to the radio to call for help as your mate's brains get sprayed all over your face. And this is all you can hear. Now, if you can't hear anything right now, that means we couldn't find a copyright-free version.
Oh, okay. You can't.
But just imagine the sheer confusion and terror of watching your entire unit being slaughtered from the shadows in a great crimson wave riding atop fucking skis of all things, and a happy poker song is the backing track to your demise. Over the next year and a half,
That is
the
a
Finns
troll.
butchered wave
Alright, yeah.
after
We've got to
wave.
listen to this.
Okay.
Right. We can't put it in because it's copyright. And that's all you
That's
hear.
all you could hear.
Oh,
That's all you could
mate,
hear was
I'd
that
be
song.
Fucking losing
That
it.
would be so
I'd be
fucking
losing it,
funny.
bruv. I'd be losing it.
Oh my god, could
What
you
a way,
imagine?
What a way to slap them.
Literally,
Just 24 hours a day.
Literally. And like you said, it's all fucking popping off with the shooting and they're just turning that on to call for someone and you're just like, nah, fuck this. At that point, you just get the gun pointed to your head and fucking go. In a video game.
Across all of the Russian radio channels, 24
They're
hours
so
a day.
savage, bro.
Imagine suddenly waking up in the middle of the night to a Finnish ambush, the cracks of rifles being your alarm clock. You're desperately scrambling to the radio to call for help as your mates'
that'd
brains
be-
get sprayed all over your face, and this is all you can hear. Over the next year and a half, the Finns butchered wave after wave of Soviets until the invasion finally ended on the 13th of March 1940. Torni and his countrymen had put up one hell of a fight, killing around 6 times more men than they had lost. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough. In an ingenious move, the Soviets had gone right back to basics and employed an unstoppable strategy that was pioneered by the ancient Romans. Chucking an inexhaustible supply of men face first into the meat grinder until the enemy runs out of steam. Even though their KD ratio had crashed straight through the fucking gutter, the Soviets had managed to claw themselves a Pyrrhic victory. With the signing of the peace treaty,
Jesus.
Russia got 10% of Finland's territory, including Torni's hometown of Viborg. Even though Torni
gonna
had
be
been awarded with the
fuming.
first and second class medals of liberty for his efforts, I don't think the consolation prize was worth the loss of his home. With nothing to do now that the fight was over,
Oh, you'd be
depressed,
so
Torni ended
fuming.
up drinking heavily and getting into fights. However, the peace would not last long, and Torni would soon get another chance to take his anger out on his real enemy.
Just with
The
a
Winter
crippling
War
alcohol
had
addiction
gone
now.
so badly for the Soviets that not only do many people to this day, including me, consider it to be a Finnish victory,
It was.
but Germany took notice. As Jerry watched the carnage reduce the Soviet advance to a stalemate, he thought to himself, yeah, I can probably take him. Yeah, that is a pretty reasonable assumption to make when you have one of the most powerful war machines in history set into overdrive, yet they could barely handle a bunch of angry Finns on skis. So the Germans jumped into action with a massive invasion of the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa. On the 22nd of June 1941, the Germans poured almost 4 million men into Russia
Crazy numbers.
and got absolutely fucking clowned on. By the end of the 6-month campaign, all the Germans had to show for their attempted invasion was almost 200,000 dead men, a complete shit show of an Eastern Front that absolutely fucked their chances of winning World War II, and the inspiration for one of Sabaton's best songs. But what does that have to do with Torni? Well, not all of the German forces got sent into the meat grinder. So Finland found themselves with an unlikely source of support. You know the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my... well, I can't exactly say friend, Nazis and all that, but the Finns
He was dancing around that
into
subject
an
for a
informal
while.
alliance with Germany, giving them passage into the Soviet Union
think we were
through
right. I
Finland
think he's gonna
in
join them.
exchange for the arms and training they would need to reclaim their land. On the 25th of June 1941, 3 days after Operation Barbarossa began, it was time for round 2, the continuation war. But before the Finns could really bring out the red in the Red Army, they had to make sure that they were ready for the counter-attack. So, Torni and 288 of his Finnish comrades were trained by the Waffen-SS in Germany. He soon
You were right.
returned to Finland with the rank of Untersturmführer, which is essentially a second lieutenant, certifying that he was ready to bring the fight to the Soviets with a hotter fury than ever. But don't worry, this isn't a villain origin story. Torni was just so angry over losing his hometown where he grew up that he didn't care who he had to work with to get it back. Torni may now technically be an SS officer, but he had no intention of going native. In fact, Torni got on with the Germans so poorly that he was actually sent back to Finland, which means he probably dodged a lot more than just one bullet, because holy fuck was Operation Barbarossa a disaster.
Yeah, fucking
But while Torni wasn't goose-stepping back to Finland, he did manage to get a lot out of his trip to Germany that would become very useful in the fights to come, such as their training, their resources, and their unbelievable fucking drip. Look, I am sorry. Hugo Boss did nothing wrong.
I laughed too soon, but I can't stop now.
Of sauerkraut, the Finns set out to reclaim their lost territory, and Torni was given his own elite unit named Detachment Tommy, and he got to handpick the men himself. This band of Baltic and glorious bastards specialised in carrying out reconnaissance and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, with orders to capture Soviet troops, disable transport, and generally scare the ever-loving shit out of the commies. And they really scared the fuck out of the commies. Detachment Torni got so far behind enemy lines that they used Soviet weapons to ensure they wouldn't run out of ammo while raiding their headquarters and communication sites.
Mate, this division,
during a recon mission on the 23rd of March 1942, Torni was severely injured when he skied over a landmine, which threatened to leave him in the sick bay for weeks. However, time spent recovering was time not spent killing communists. So despite the fact that not all of the shrapnel had been removed from him yet, Torni escaped from the hospital and got stuck back into the carnage, earning himself an Iron Cross for leading his men into a firefight to rescue a wounded officer.
Yes.
Oh, and they did that charge while rattling off machine guns on skis. They were firing machine guns while skiing into battle. Now, I know that sounds goofy and ridiculous as hell, but I don't think it would have been for the Soviets on the receiving end of it. Detachment Torni was a force to be reckoned with. They did so much damage and inflicted so many casualties that a 3 million Finnish mark bounty was put on Torni's head by the Soviets, which is roughly $700,000 US. And he was reportedly the only Finnish soldier that was singled out like this during this particular conflict. I know in the last conflict, it was Simo Hall,
you're a massive
which is probably the greatest honour that Torni received in his career. Imagine making your enemy so fucking scared of you that they issue a bounty. I mean, Torni is an enemy soldier in a war. It was already the Soviet troops' job to kill him, but he was such a terrifying force in nature that the higher-ups had to provide a 7-figure incentive to get them to actually fight him. However, the only thing that this bounty did was give Torni...
Oh, guys, that's so funny. They were so fucking terrified that they had to go, yeah, but you'll get 700. See, me and you would be like, £700,000, change my life, or die? Let's go get him.
Let's go hunt, boys.
That would be my condition. If I get his head, I'll take 500,000 and I get to go home. That's it. You don't call me back out.
Even more clout. Because it was never claimed. After Torni proved that the only person that could possibly hurt him was himself, he and his detachment continued their reign of terror until the 9th of June 1944, when the Red Army launched an attack on the Karelian Isthmus. Torni and his detachment ended up surrounded, resulting in the loss of many, many men.
Shit.
Soviet men, because Detachment Torni just tore that encirclement maneuver to shreds, and for good measure,
his delivery is so
on
good.
His own mission behind Soviet lines and stole their battle plans, which helped his command the Soviet attack
Stole
on Guerrilla.
the plans. Oh my god.
This guy didn't give a shit.
Holy fucking
Give a shit.
Holy shit.
I want this man on my team.
Oh my god, this is only the second army, Jack.
This is...
To a grinding halt. About a month later, Detachment Torni was ordered to hold a strategically important crossroads against an onslaught of 4,000 Soviet troops. However, by this point, his unit had been whittled down to fewer than 100 men.
Okay.
So, what did he do? Did he find a bottleneck to trap the Soviets in? Did he just go for a good old-fashioned heroic last stand? Nope. He made a decision that surely had the great DM in the sky wringing his hands together with glee. He split the party. Torni divided his men into much smaller units and had them pick off the Soviets while constantly on the move, hoping that it would trick the Soviets into believing they were up against a much bigger force. The next thing that Torni did was roll a nat 20 on his deception check because it fucking worked. Once again, a Soviet advance was halted by hundreds of men suddenly becoming good communists.
Wait,
However,
what?
this was no ordinary battle. As the massacre went on, Torni suddenly found himself seriously injured by the most powerful man on the Eastern Front, a final boss that Torni barely escaped with his life. Himself. He stepped on another fucking mine. How could someone so badass go down like such a fucking idiot? As Torni recovered from the injuries to his body and probably his ego as well, he found out that he had been promoted to captain and awarded with the Cross of Mannerheim, which is the Finnish equivalent of the Yanks Medal of Honor or our Victoria Cross. For his heroic and ingenious defence of that crossroads, Torni received the highest award in the land for gallantry, which came with a cash prize of 50,000 marks. So, to celebrate, Torni went out with the boys and they all completely drank the money away. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Despite being the MVP of the continuation war and carrying the Finnish counterattack, he couldn't quite clutch a victory. As powerful as the Finnish meat grinder was, the Soviets still had too much fodder to handle. So, the continuation war came to a disappointing end on the 19th of September 1944. Once again, there were humiliating concessions for Finland, including handing over more land, demobilising most of their army, paying a ton of reparations, and legalising the Communist Party of Finland. Never again would Torni's hometown be a part of Finland. But the worst part of this treaty was the fact that the Finns were also told to kick out the Germans, which started the Lapland War between the Finns and their former allies. The Finns just couldn't catch a break, but hey-ho, at least they managed to win this new war. However, Torni did not take part in the Lapland War, because he was among the troops that had been demobilised. But he was far from done with fighting the Soviets. The unemployed Torni went fuck this and took a U-boat to Hamburg, and he joined the Germans as part of a resistance movement that aimed to carry out a boogaloo against the Soviets in Finland. The SS started to train him in sabotage, but the programme ended up being cut short by the Red Army's advance. Because of this, Torni ultimately ended up sticking around in Germany for the rest of the war because everything was going to shit and he had actually missed the last boat back to Finland. So he just thought to himself, well, if the Soviets are coming here anyway, I might as well just hang around and fight them here. And fight them he did until he finally saw the writing on the wall and made a tactical move that saved he and his men's lives.
Okay.
He marched over to West Germany as the war came to a close so that they could all surrender to the British instead of the Soviets, because the British were nice to POWs and the Soviets. However, Torni did not stay in the POW camp that the Brits put him in for too long.
Okay.
He heard that a bunch of the prisoners were going to be sent to the Soviets for trial. Torni knew that if he was one of them, the British would essentially be signing his death warrant.
Yeah.
He was also worried that the British would find out about his past membership of the SS. Torni decided not to take the risk of finding out if he was being transferred or not, and instead just escaped, finally returning to the homeland that he fought so hard to protect. However, he did not receive the welcome that he expected. He was instead immediately arrested for high treason by his own ungrateful people who were really, really keen to wash their hands of any association with their former allies. I mean, I can see why the fact that Torni had joined the SS is a little bit of a bad look, you know, but it's not as if he actually got on well with them. He didn't agree with them. He never had any intentions of actually fighting for the Germans. He only did it as an excuse to kill communists. However, Finland was still more or less at the mercy of the Soviets, so you can understand why Torni was treated like this. It also didn't help that members of the newly legalised Communist Party had weaseled their way into pretty powerful positions, including the head of Finland's intelligence service. But the public perception of what was essentially a show trial was actually very polarised. Despite the perception that Torni was a Nazi war criminal, there were many that believed him to be a hero, that just had a raging hate boner for communists, and he had his judgment affected by his horniness for slaughtering the Red Army. In October of 1946, Torni was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but he was out by the following spring, casually strolling through the exit to freedom. Completely unbeknownst to the guards because he escaped. I'll head out, and then he just walked out the front door. However, Torni soon found himself back behind bars, but not because he was caught. The authorities falsely accused Torni of theft to flush him out, so he turned himself in again to clear his name. Torni sacrificed his freedom and got an extra 6 months added to his sentence because he couldn't bear the false smear on his reputation.
I see.
Part of me thinks that's kind of stupid. Part of me kind of admires that.
Sometime
later, he tried to escape again by abseiling out of an unsecured window with a grappling hook that he made out of bed sheets and scrap metal. However, this attempt was not successful. Torni was very quickly spotted by a guard that took a shot at him. Luckily, the rifle malfunctioned, but being spotted was enough, and Torni was quickly recaptured. As Soviet influence over Finland diminished over time, the country eventually became uncooked enough for its president to give one of its best warriors a break. Torni was pardoned less than halfway through his sentence in December of 1948. He still served 2 years too many, but what can you do? However, Torni was not given a hero's welcome back into society. He was stripped of his rank, and he had his name removed from official war records. And as if that dishonour wasn't bad enough, he also found himself to be really unpopular on the outside. Despite his pardon, the fact that he had fought with the Germans left a permanent black mark on Torni's reputation, and he was under constant suspicion. Feeling betrayed by his fatherland, unhappy with the Scipio Africanus treatment, and eager for a fresh start, Torni moved to Sweden in 1949 under the name of Lass or Lassie. I don't know, Scandi language. He went from cutting down commies to cutting down trees while waiting for his application for a Venezuelan visa to be accepted. He was still very concerned about the fact that the Soviets really wanted him to be extradited for trial as a German collaborator. So he of course planned to emigrate to South America, just like many other people in a similar situation. The plan was for Torni to join a community of fellow Finnish expats in Venezuela, where he would work odd jobs to get by as he made a new life for himself.
Okay.
But before his visa could arrive, something unexpected happened that threw a wrench into his entire plan. A woman. While he was lumberjacking his waiting period away, Torni met a girl named Marja, and he fell happily in love with her. So much so that they moved into her parents' villa near Stockholm together.
Greatest man will always
spending the
fall
40s fighting and dealing with the consequences of war, Torni and the love of his life celebrate.
You gotta stop the sexism, man.
I'm not being sexist, I'm just joking.
I know.
The start of the new decade by getting engaged on the 1st of January 1950. Marja then excitedly went to Finland to pick Torni's military uniform for him to wear on the big day. However, while she was away, the time came for Torni to take a trip of his own. His Venezuelan visa arrived, and he was so worried about the Soviets managing to get him extradited that he couldn't afford to wait for Marja to return. Torni made the tough choice and got onto the ship to Venezuela, leaving his fiancée behind with only a promise. I'll come back to pick you up. You will receive my word of honour as an officer and a gentleman. Torni landed in Caracas in March of 1950 for what ultimately became a glorified pit stop. During a stint as a sailor on a cargo ship bound for the United States, Torni decided to pursue the American dream. So, on the 20th of September 1950, he just jumped off the fucking boat. He just leaps overboard in the Gulf of Mexico and then just swam to the United States.
There's no fucking way.
I'll give it to this guy.
There is no fucking
I'll give it
way.
to him. He's fucking doing quite well.
Just jumps off the
He's
fucking
just
boat
like,
and just like, yeah, I can make it to America. Oh my god.
So, from the beaches of Mobile, Alabama, Torni then made his way to Brooklyn, where the Finnish-American community gave him a hand in getting set up with a carpentry job. But Torni didn't have very long to get settled in his new home, because he was arrested by the feds in 1951. You know, because back then America actually had an immigration policy. However, being something of a living legend had its perks, because Torni happened to be friends with the president of a Finnish Veterans Association, who managed to introduce Torni to one of the bigwigs over at the OSS, William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan saw that Torni's prowess as a commando could be a real benefit to the CIA precursor. So he pulled some strings, and Torni had a residence permit by 1953. After all, it was the height of the Red Scare. Why would we deport one of the Soviets' boogeymen?
Yeah.
Also, isn't it really weird how the CIA is involved in so many mad lads? It's super strange, but anyway, as a citizen, Torni then made good on his promise to his fiancée. However,
I think that name was like someone to do with the creating of CIA or something to do with that. That's why I said, why should we know that name?
However, it was too late. While Torni was off trying to get established in the new world, the couple had drifted apart, and by the time he returned, Marja had found someone else and moved to Las Palmas on the Canary Islands. Despite being one of Finland's biggest badasses and the scourge of the Red Army, it seemed like settling down was the one mission that Torni just wasn't equipped for. So, In January of 1954, it was time for him to embrace his destiny. The commies were still out there, and peace was clearly not an option. The seasoned warrior adopted his third flag and took up arms once again. Captain Lauri Allan Torni became Private Lauri Allan Torni of the US Army. With this fresh start, he finally had one less L to his name. Such a shite joke. The Lodge Philbin Act had allowed a foreign national like the newly christened Thorn to enlist. He had to do so as a private. So he was stuck doing basic training with 19-year-olds at the age of 34.
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on? I know more than you. All right.
However, his English wasn't too great, so he got by in a similar manner to his Swedish unit. Hand gestures and swearing. But this language barrier didn't stall his progress up the chain of command because, once again, he had some Finnish American friends to help him out. They managed to get him into Special Forces, where he underwent further specialised training, and he became an officer for the third time, just 3 years after entering basic. This specialised training was a mountain and arid cold weather survival course. Now, just call me out if I'm wrong. I believe that Thorn may already know a thing or two about that, but the Yanks did have a thing or two to teach Thorn as they put him through a paratrooper course, where he then began teaching himself at the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where he instructed his fellow soldiers in skiing, survival, mountaineering, and guerrilla tactics.
Okay.
Because Finnish, at this point, Thorn was really floating it down the career track. After all, he'd already done it twice, so in 1957 he was commissioned as an officer in the Army Signal Corps, where he ended up getting a lot of action. They say that all is fair in love and war, and it turns out that at this stage in his career, Thorn really gave his all in both. He may never have married, but unsurprisingly he proved himself to be a real Chad. At every single party he went to, he reportedly had a single-minded determination to leave with whoever caught his eye, whether she was single or not. But despite having the highest body count in the Green Berets, in both senses, Thorn still spent plenty of nights out
big body count
with the boys, where he partied as hard as he fought. However, as many night outs tend to do, these two things often overlapped. In December of 1958, while serving with the 11th Airborne Division in Bavaria, Thorn got himself into a little bit of a scrap at a bar, which ended with him throwing some of the locals out of a window. Now, that sounds like a pretty badass, albeit tame, night out by Scottish standards, but it ended up landing Thorn in serious trouble. He was court-martialed. But, as it so happened, most of the Germans that he had just beaten the shit out of had criminal records, and the police were actually looking for two of them. So, you could argue that Thorn actually did them a favour.
Yeah.
Thorn was acquitted the following October, but he did not return to the 11th Airborne Division. Instead, Thorn took a transfer to West Germany to serve with the 10th Group of Special Forces, better known as the Green Berets. True to form, he severely outperformed everyone, with one commanding officer remarking, "I have not known any officer in his grade to whom he can be compared. He is over 40 years old, but he has the physical ability of a person of 25. Needless to say that Thorn was such a nasty physical force that the Green Berets had no choice but to make him a legend. So he was soon promoted to captain. In 1962, Thorn served as the second in command of a search and rescue mission in Iran, on its border with Turkey and the Soviet Union in the Zagros Mountains. The mission was to recover bodies and classified documents from a crashed plane. The mission was so dangerous that this was actually the fourth attempt. But Thorne's unrelenting spirit was credited for its success. But while Thorne was having a very productive career with the Green Berets, the work he was doing wasn't exactly what he was born for.
I see.
He was born to kill communists.
communists.
I mean, sure, he
That's
was
what he wants to
kicking
do.
as much arse as ever, but his true enemies were still out there and just out of reach. However, that would soon change as the 1960s rolled around. The commies were at it again.
It's Vietnam now, baby. It's Vietnam!
In early 1963, Thorne found himself stationed at the Civilian Irregular Defence Group Camp in T Bien in Vietnam, where he worked with South Vietnamese forces as a military advisor. In this role, he taught them guerrilla tactics and helped fend off Viet Cong attacks on their bases, continuing his own tradition of giving everything you have to fight a guerrilla war against communist opposition with the aid of a military superpower, kicking an ungodly amount of arse in the process, and then losing. But just because his role in the Vietnam War was only an advisory one doesn't mean that Thorne didn't get his own fair share of the carnage. Viet Cong forces eventually breached the perimeter of the camp, and Thorne and his entire detachment were injured in its defence. But nevertheless, they all stood their ground and managed to prevent the place from being completely overrun, which earned Thorne a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. His injuries also gave him the chance to be transferred out of combat,
But
which
no.
he naturally turned down.
Yeah.
In fact, not only did he refuse to take it easy, but the fucking unit actually requested to be put in charge of a special operations base while he was still injured. However, Thorne's tour couldn't last forever. After having more than done his duty, he eventually returned home for a well-earned rest. But there was just one problem. Thorne couldn't kill any communists at home. It was clear that Thorne still had plenty more fight in him. So he went back to the jungle. In February of 1965, Thorne volunteered for a second tour with an off-the-books unit named Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, which played an advisory role, specialising in unconventional warfare. On the 18th of October
What did those boys
1965,
get up
Thorne
to?
joined this unit on a clandestine search and destroy mission in Laos, which was outside of the jurisdiction of the United States, you know, because as if that's ever fucking stopped them. The job was carrying out airstrikes in a bid to sabotage Viet Cong movements across the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Thorne was in a unmarked helicopter directing support to his men on the ground. But the mission was made very difficult because the weather was not in their favour at all. The conditions were so bad that visibility was almost non-existent, and the other helicopters had to climb up to 8,000 feet before they could see over the clouds. However, Thorne refused to order his helicopter to leave because despite the awful weather conditions, he wouldn't abandon his men on the ground. Only once the mission was eventually completed did he finally withdraw. But by this point, it was too late. 5 minutes after Thorne gave the order to haul arse out of there, his helicopter disappeared among the mountains of Vietnam's Phuc Song district within Quang Nam province. Despite more than 50 attempts, no crash site was found during the rescue operation, because mostly of the thick tree cover, and also because it was very difficult to send teams in because America wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. So sadly, there was no other option than to declare Captain Larry Thorne dead on the 19th of October 1966 at the age of 47. That's actually kind of weird because today's date is the 19th of October 2022. It's the anniversary of his death right now. Weird. For his heroics, he was posthumously promoted to Major and awarded the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Flying Cross. However, his loss wasn't in vain. His men had located and called in 51 airstrikes against supply stations across the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they all lived to tell the tale, meaning that Thorne's final mission was a success, even if the war as a whole was not. However, not everyone took this declaration very well. There were those that believed that Thorne hadn't died at all. After all, how could such a powerful legend go out in such an anticlimactic fashion? There were whispers that Thorne had actually been caught by the Soviets and met his end in a gulag, while others believed he was still out there fighting the good fight against the commies, like those Japanese holdouts fighting World War II like 30 years after it ended. Personally, I like to think he died as he lived, giving everything he could to fight against communism and fully cementing himself as the only person that could harm himself. But regardless of what happened, Thorne's old war buddies and other veterans across the US and Finland would raise a toast to him every year, wherever he may be. But while decades passed with no news of Thorne's fate, he couldn't evade discovery forever. In 1999, Thorne's helicopter was finally found on the Laotian border by Joint Task Force Full Accounting, where it was discovered that the helicopter had crashed into the side of a mountain. And sadly, in the wreckage, they found Thorne's body. After 33 years, Thorne's remains, his Swedish-made machine pistol, and the remains of his crew were recovered from the crash site. After the remains were formally identified and returned to the United States, Thorne was finally laid to rest with full military honours in Arlington Cemetery on the 26th of June 2003. Buried alongside him are his comrades from that fateful mission: Lieutenant Bao Tung Nguyen, First Lieutenant T Long Tha, and Sergeant Van Lan Bui. And the pilot Wee Gon Crash. I'm sorry. Thorne left behind a pretty complex legacy, as you can see from his rather unique roster of awards. And the fact is, he is actually the only member of the Waffen SS to have ever been buried at Arlington Cemetery. Unfortunately, the Nazi allegations haunted his reputation for the rest of his life. You know, can relate. But while there are a few out there that believe that Thorne went native in the worst possible way, it isn't hard to figure out what his true nature was, because pretty much everyone that knew him would be eager to tell you. The man just really fucking hated communists.
Yeah, he really
hated them.
That
they
was all it
took
was.
his hometown from him and murdered his friends. Right? He hated them, and he didn't care who he had to work with to get back at them. One of Thorne's commanding officers said that he would, and I quote, fight to serve with him again under similar conditions, particularly in combat requiring great maturity, perseverance, physical and moral courage, and personal leadership. And this is just one of many, many ways that Thorne has had his praises sung, because he was, by all accounts, a great fucking guy that was loved by everyone that met him. You know, as long as they were on the right side of the battlefield. Moino Koivisto, one of Thorne's fellow soldiers who went on to become Finland's president, also said, and I quote, Torni as a leader was liked. In many ways, he emphasised that we are all the same bunch, and he bore his share just like the others. He did not ask anyone to do something that he did not do himself. He carried his own load, marched at the lead, and was one of us. To this day, Thorne seems to remain the gold standard for what a good soldier should be. As a US Army Special Forces colonel put it in 2010, he was a complex yet driven man who valorously fought oppression under 3 flags and didn't acknowledge the meaning of quit. The US Army Special Forces continues to honour Thorne's legacy with the Larry Thorne Award, which is given annually to the toughest Green Beret detachment. Though I doubt that any of them could match the sheer grit and indomitable spirit of the great man himself. In addition to his acclaim amongst the military, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that a soldier of such legendary fame and renown has made a considerable mark on pop culture. After all, he has been one of the most requested Mad Lads that we have ever covered. Like, Lauri Torni was up there in the top 5. So many people were asking for Lauri Torni. And also, Thorne's defence of the Civilian Irregular Defence Group camp in Vietnam actually inspired a book, which was then adapted into a John Wayne movie that everyone fucking hated. And also, and possibly most importantly, the story of his career was immortalised with an absolute banger of a Sabaton song. Even though Thorne was on the losing side of every single war he fought in, it is always the great strength and courage of men like him that make a real positive change in the world. He never once gave up the fight for what he believed in, and the way his sheer dedication surely inspired countless others to do the same might just be his greatest victory. Unfortunately, he didn't get to live long enough to see the collapse of the tyrants that took his home from him.
What a shame.
Some people say that Larry Thorne is a very complex character with a very complex career. But, to be perfectly honest, it can all be boiled down to the man just really fucking hated communists.
He really fucking hated communists.
I enjoyed that.
I really enjoyed that as well. It was a very, very good video. Count Dankula makes amazing videos as always. If you guys are looking forward to us reacting to the Sabaton song of this, because we definitely are looking forward to that, you know what you need to do. But if you haven't already, head over to Count Dankula's page. That link's in the description box down below. Like, comment, subscribe. We will catch you in the next video.
In a bit.